We're still in a very large and rich economy, but there are some long-standing problems in the UK. As you are saying in your question, there has been a slowdown since the financial crisis. Productivity growth has flatlined. People call it the productivity puzzle because we don't understand why it's quite so bad. But our productivity performance has been bad for 40 years. It's lagged behind the other advanced economies. And we've got the most regionally divided economy in the European Union, certainly, with great extremes between London and the southeast, the motor of growth, and the rest of the country. And a lot of problems that we've known about for ages, the skills mismatches, the underperformance of some groups of people in their education, and the lack of investment in some areas of business, the inability to translate advanced research into commercial businesses. So that's quite a long list of long-standing issues that really need addressing. I think it can be addressed. I don't know how easy it's going to be because it will require quite a big change of political direction. The economic centralisation seems to me to follow from the political centralisation, and we have very centralised decision making in Whitehall and Westminster. And although we've had some devolution to the city regions recently, it's been pretty hesitant, and I think we need to go much further before we see a return to anything like the Victorian and Edwardian era of the great cities of the United Kingdom forging their own path for growth. But if we want to see the national productivity and economic performance improve, then it has to improve in all the regions that are not London and the South East. We can't do it on one engine. It will just carry on overheating the way it has done in our boom and bust experience of the past. I don't find it very helpful to think in terms of manufacturing and services. It's much more helpful to think in terms of high-value leading companies and the ecosystems of businesses the supply chains that they build around them. And that could be either. Of course, manufacturing is important, and a lot of the frontier of science and technology will translate into manufacturing businesses that will hopefully grow very quickly. But even really large manufacturing companies will have a very high proportion of their sales and profits coming from the services that they provide around the manufactured goods. So it's a question, I think, of different areas working out what their strengths are and building out from those. It could be manufacturing. In Sheffield, we've seen the Advanced Manufacturing Research Centre seed a very successful cluster of training and businesses and having links with the university. In Manchester, it would be a different set, where we have, of course, graphene, but we've got a tech sector and the financial services and professional services sector as well. In other parts of the country, it will be something different. In Bristol, aerospace, creative. So it's a question of looking for what are those things that will seed the pearl, as it were, and create an engine of growth in different parts of the country. There are some people who think that a declining pound will help boost exports. It also raises the cost of imported components. So the benefit of the pound for our exports is not as strong as it would have been 15 or 20 years ago anyway. But the key to export success is making really high quality products and services that people overseas want to buy. Germany has had a strong exchange rate for as long as I can remember, and it's the export powerhouse of Europe. So I don't think looking to the exchange rate to help us on external trade is really going to make much difference at all. To be able to export more, close the trade gap, thrive post-Brexit, what we need to do is concentrate on turning the fantastic research that happens in British universities into high-value companies, getting the skills problem fixed, because we know that we have a major problem there, the mismatches, but also the failure to upskill great swathes of people who are not going to be academic successes. And all of those things about management of companies and business support, the list is well known, and what's really been lacking is a consistent policy attention to doing all of the very detailed things that need doing. There hasn't been that consistency. We've had policy seesaws in all of these areas. To take just one example, in further education, 28 major changes in 40 years. It's absolutely ridiculous. So one of the key things about Britain's economic future will be getting enough policy consensus for it to be less partisan, less of a seesaw than it has been, and to look at all of those long-standing problems we know we have and buckle down and fix them. There are some economists who are sceptical about industrial strategy because they think about it as a plea for tax breaks or subsidies for specific sectors, and I absolutely share that scepticism. But the idea that you can have an advanced economy growing without close relationships between the government and the private sector is just absurd. And no other country apart from the UK has stepped back from government coordination of economic activity in the way that we have in this country. Even the Americans, although they don't call it industrial policy, have one. They operate it through research funding in biotech or through the defence research budget. But it's very much an industrial policy or industrial strategy. Governments have to set technical standards, they have to align different activities, they can create markets. In the UK with the National Health Service, we could create an innovation fund and a guaranteed market for new health innovations, but the government has to be involved in that. The private sector can't do it. And government research crowds in private research, it doesn't crowd it out. So I hope we now have enough of a cross-party consensus that the government does need to engage with the private sector in building long-term high-value growth. We came up with the name Universal Basic Infrastructure, obviously as a play on the idea of universal basic income. Whenever there's fear about automation destroying lots of jobs, the idea of universal basic income comes back into fashion. And for me, it doesn't really go far enough. It's an individual solution to collective problems, because if you're given an income, never mind the fact it's probably not going to be a very large one if it's universal, there's a lot that you can't do with your own individual income. I couldn't take my money and go out and make sure the roads get mended, or there's a good public transport system, or there are good schools for my children to go to. So the idea of universal basic infrastructure is that you give people everywhere agency by giving them the assets they need to make what they want of their lives. So this includes soft infrastructure, but you guarantee that there's a minimum standard for their school, a minimum standard of healthcare, the connectivity they need, the transport systems they need to go and travel to work wherever they want to. And we don't have that. 20% of the schools in the country are failing, according to Ofsted, and they tend to be in areas where all of those other problems of poor transport, poor health, bad housing and so on are all concentrated together. So universal basic infrastructure is a minimum guarantee that actually is a pledge of a lot more investment in certain parts of the country. In the past, I think GDP has been a decent metric of prosperity. What it really captures over long periods of time is innovation, all the innovations that have transformed the quality of our life. And so if I compare how the average person, the typical person lives now compared to the 1970s, whether it's life expectancy, quality of life in old age, access to central heating, all the communications technologies, all of these things, there has been tremendous progress. But there are two problems. One is that GDP only measures the flow of income or consumption, and it therefore tells you nothing about the sustainability of the growth that you're experiencing. Keynes famously said, in the long run we're all dead, but he said it 70 years ago, and we've got to the long run now, and the environmental impacts of growth are becoming really very serious. So we need a different kind of measure that will tell us about sustainability. The other change has been in the kinds of innovation that we have now, where digital technology is changing business models. It's giving people access to lots of free goods. A lot of them have the character of public goods. People all over the place are putting for free online really valuable services or software. And so the gap between what GDP measures, which is activity at market prices in the market, and any underlying sense of economic welfare, it become so wide that it's very hard to read what the GDP figures are telling us now. I think the most important of these is about sustainability, and I think about it again in terms of what assets do individuals have access to that allow them to lead the kind of life they want and to prosper. And so there are 6 categories of assets that I would argue are important. Natural capital is one of them. Also, obviously, money, financial capital, physical capital, intangible capital, human capital and social capital. And we don't have a good theoretical understanding of all of these or how to measure them, so it would be quite a big project. But I think it's important to work out what the next set of frameworks is for understanding prosperity, because GDP dates from the 1930s and 40s and it's outlived its usefulness now. It isn't the case that all the economists said it was going to be doom and gloom. One set did, it was the Treasury, and they obviously had to take account of what the Chancellor told them he would do, had he stayed Chancellor. That was an outlier. The other outlier was the economists for Brexit group. They were way too optimistic about what would happen after the vote. Most economic forecasts were pretty close to what's actually happened. The uncertainty is weighing on growth. We're the slowest now in the G7, and that uncertainty will continue to weigh in the short to medium term. Like 90% of other economists who answered the surveys before the vote, I'm still very pessimistic about the long-term impact of Brexit. And that's because of the potential to disrupt trading relationships, where a lot of trade now, more than 2/3, consists of components and not finished products. So we are not trading cheddar cheese for prosciutto anymore. We're not in that kind of world. We are importing components or exporting components in pan-European supply chains. People talk about Brexit as leaving the club. It's a completely misleading metaphor. It's leaving your past 45 years of economic relationships. That's going to be incredibly damaging. Some of it is and some of it isn't. A lot of people who criticise economics make sweeping generalisations about the whole discipline without knowing what most economists do. What most of us do now is very detailed empirical work looking at particular markets or particular policy interventions, and it doesn't fall foul of any of the things that people often claim. You know, we don't always assume that people make rational, selfish decisions. We can assume all kinds of things about behaviour and will be guided by what the data say about how people are behaving. There are three separate problems, I think. One is macroeconomics of forecasting. Many people think forecasting is what most economists do, and most don't. But some do, and the character of forecasts isn't well understood. It's like saying there are certain kinds of trends or forces in the economy, and this is the most likely outcome. But we can no more say there will be a recession and growth will be only minus 0.5% than your doctor can say to you, you're going to get lung cancer in January 2025 because you've been smoking. So it's more like saying smoking is bad for you. So there's that misunderstanding about forecasts and macroeconomics. And the state of macro is not good because it didn't incorporate all the things that led to the financial crisis. So there's that area of the subject where I think criticisms are valid. The student criticisms, I think, are also valid. I've been involved for 5 years now in a project to develop an alternative economic curriculum that addresses a lot of the things that they complained about, that it includes real-world questions like income distribution and how to tackle that, power in the workplace, zero-hours contracts, environmental economics. So we've put all of those in there, and in many courses they had been absent. So I think the teaching of economics has been changing rapidly, although it will seem slow to students because the pace of reform in the university is slower than students would really like, and understandably so. And then the third area is that a lot of people in policy who think about economics or do it were trained 20 years ago at the height of what is called the rational expectations revolution, when that assumption, that kind of reductionist assumption about how people behaved was at its height. There's been 20 years of a move away from that, and it's not what actual researchers do anymore, but I think it still prevails too much in the world of policy and it's too simplistic. So that's quite a complicated answer to say some of the criticism is valid and some of it isn't. The starting point is that it's a very male-dominated subject. It's about a quarter of undergraduates. It drops off at every level, so when you go to graduate school, junior academic jobs, senior academic jobs, but also in the city, the proportion of women declines. But it's also true of other forms of diversity. More and more economics is taught in private schools and not state schools, where business studies is taught more often. So the social mix of people doing economics is becoming narrower. And the ethnic mix as well is a pretty white subject too. And the diversity of the profession matters not just because of natural justice. Why would we want to be like philosophy or computer science? Why would we want to be so narrow? But also because it's a social science. And I think for it to be a good social science, it has to have a wider range of social experience among the people who are actually doing it. So we were discussing earlier the criticisms people make of economics, and I think they can be addressed and are being. But for me, this social mix, the social composition of the discipline is the most existentially challenging.